The moment Princess Anne said enough, the entire illusion cracked, and suddenly Meghan Markle wasn't just facing whispers anymore, she was staring down a royal wall that had quietly been building for months, brick by brick, fueled by concern, anger, and something far more dangerous than public. Scandal, internal judgment. Because behind those palace gates in January 2026, something explosive happened that forced Princess Anne to step forward and draw a line so bold, so unshakable, that Meghan's carefully constructed world began trembling under its weight. And the most devastating part wasn't about titles or power or reputation. It was about a 6-year-old girl named Lilibet and the future everyone suddenly realized might already be slipping out of her hands.
We get a glimpse of his grandchildren when Meghan decides to pimp them out on the Drew Barrymore.
Expertly curating her kids' online profiles for maximum brand value. That's
behind them, out of focus, sortish photo, and yet again, it's a rare photo that Meghan's providing of Archie.
That quiet emergency meeting inside Buckingham Palace didn't look dramatic from the outside. No sirens, no chaos, no shouting echoing through marble halls. But inside that room, the atmosphere was heavy with something far worse than noise: certainty. Princess Anne was seated at the center, calm, composed, but completely immovable. King Charles was there, physically present, not delegating, not observing from a distance. Prince William sat nearby, silent but visibly hardened. Duchess Sophie leaned forward, focused, and surrounding them weren't just family members. They were professionals, child welfare experts, outsiders, people the monarchy never brings in unless something has already crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. This wasn't about appearances. This wasn't about image. This was about intervention, because what they had been shown, what had reached their desks, was something nobody in that room could ignore. Information passed quietly through Harry's own UK team had revealed details that turned vague concern into undeniable alarm. It wasn't gossip. It wasn't speculation. It was structure. Schedules, contracts, hours tracked down to individual days. And at the center of it all was Lilibet, a child whose daily life looked less like childhood and more like obligation.
This was considered a serious interruption of duty of care. But it was the financial documentation that shifted the mood from concern.
January 23rd, 2026. That was the day everything shifted. Because that was the moment the palace stopped waiting. The statement they released didn't hide behind royal vagueness. It didn't soften the edges or bury the meaning. It used one word that hit like a hammer: commodify. That wasn't accidental. That wasn't poetic. That was deliberate. It meant the palace believed someone had crossed the invisible line between raising a child and managing an asset. And everyone knew exactly who that word was aimed at. Behind closed doors, what they had uncovered painted a picture so unsettling, it forced Princess Anne into a role she had avoided for years. Not observer, but protector. Because when investigators laid out Lilibet's weekly routine, it didn't resemble freedom. It resembled structure built around productivity. Mondays and Wednesdays were spent filming short-form content tied to Meghan's brand. Thursdays were dedicated to voice training sessions, preparing her for narrated content and audio work. Fridays involved product photo shoots and promotional material. And weekends that should have belonged to playgrounds and laughter, were filled with live stream appearances, product demonstrations, and curated digital engagement. Between October and December of 2025 alone, Lilibet logged 192 hours in structured commercial activity. That wasn't imagination. That wasn't exaggeration. That was documented time a 6-year-old had spent fulfilling obligations most adults would find exhausting. But numbers weren't what broke the room. It was what came next. Because eventually, someone sat down with Lilibet. Not a camera, not a brand manager, not a director, a child psychologist. Someone whose job wasn't to capture her image, but to hear her voice. And when she spoke, she didn't complain. She didn't rebel. She didn't demand anything dramatic. She simply said she wanted to go somewhere she didn't have to smile all the time. She wanted to be with Archie. That sentence echoed through Buckingham Palace like thunder. Because it revealed something nobody could ignore anymore. This wasn't about ambition. This wasn't about branding. This was about a child who had already learned that her value was tied to performance. A child who understood at 6 years old that smiling wasn't always a choice, it was an expectation. Prince William reportedly didn't respond immediately. He didn't argue. He didn't debate. He simply absorbed it. And those close to the moment said his expression said everything. Because he knew exactly what that meant. He had lived it. But what made it worse, what turned concern into urgency, was Archie. Because while Lilibet was everywhere, Archie was nowhere. 14 months had passed without a single public appearance, no photographs, no events, no visibility, nothing. And reports coming from his school painted a picture of withdrawal, emotional distance, and discomfort around cameras. Even Harry himself had observed the change. Archie reportedly became anxious whenever filming equipment entered his environment, retreating into himself as if he already understood the cameras didn't just observe, they consumed. 2 children, one overexposed, one disappearing. Princess Anne saw it clearly, and unlike others, she didn't hesitate. Because Princess Anne wasn't reacting to headlines, she was reacting to patterns. Contracts attached to a 6-year-old's name, educational disruption, structured commercial schedules. Emotional indicators no child should be forced to carry. And for her, the conclusion wasn't complicated. Children weren't extensions of legacy. They weren't vehicles for redemption. They weren't instruments of narrative correction. They were children. And children needed protection, even when protection meant standing against someone who refused to see the danger. But nothing could have prepared Meghan for what happened next. Because just days after that emergency meeting, Harry made a move so unexpected, so decisive, it shattered whatever fragile balance still existed between private disagreement and public war. He filed for full custody. Not shared custody, not negotiation, full custody, and he did it without warning her. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't about argument anymore, this was about removal. Because in his filing, Harry didn't accuse Meghan of malice. He accused the situation of harm. He described the separation of the children's emotional realities as trauma waiting to happen. He framed his request not as retaliation, but as rescue. When Meghan found out, the shock rippled instantly through her inner circle. Because suddenly, this wasn't palace concern. This wasn't internal discussion. This was legal reality. And when she responded, her proposal revealed something that sent Princess Anne into quiet fury. Meghan proposed that Archie could live with Harry in the UK most of the year, but Lilibet would remain in California permanently because of her career systems. Career systems. That phrase changed everything. Because in that moment, Princess Anne realized this wasn't temporary exposure. This wasn't situational involvement. This was infrastructure, intentional, planned, protected. And Princess Anne knew exactly what that meant. She wasn't watching a mother guide her child. She was watching a future being claimed before the child was old enough to understand it. And that's when Princess Anne made the decision that would send shockwaves through Meghan's world and force a confrontation nobody could stop. Meghan Markle had spent years mastering control. Control of narrative, control of perception, control of timing. But nothing prepared her for the moment Princess Anne stopped playing by those silent royal rules and began moving with purpose so precise, so unflinching, that it sent a message louder than any press conference ever could. Because Princess Anne wasn't interested in optics anymore. She was interested in outcome. And once she saw Meghan's custody response, the words career systems attached to a 6-year-old child, something inside her shifted permanently. This wasn't theory anymore. This wasn't speculation. This was confirmation. Behind palace doors, Princess Anne didn't explode. She didn't shout. She did something far more dangerous. She organized. She began assembling everything. The timelines, the contracts, the educational withdrawals, the hours logged, the psychological reports. Every single piece of evidence that painted a complete, undeniable picture of what Lilibet's life had quietly become. Because Princess Anne understood something Meghan didn't yet realize. The monarchy wasn't reacting emotionally. It was reacting structurally. And once the crown moves structurally, it doesn't reverse. What terrified Meghan's camp wasn't public criticism. She had survived that before. What terrified them was silence, because suddenly palace communications stopped responding to her team's outreach. No informal discussions, no friendly intermediaries, no quiet reassurances, just stillness. And that stillness meant preparation. Meanwhile, Harry had already crossed the point of no return. His custody filing wasn't symbolic. It was specific. He wasn't just requesting legal authority, he was documenting emotional urgency. He had described how Archie physically reacted to cameras, how his son withdrew, how his behavior changed in environments tied to production and branding. He wasn't arguing about parenting philosophy, he was arguing about psychological impact. And Princess Anne supported him, not publicly, not loudly, but decisively. Because she saw what others refused to acknowledge. She saw the contrast. One child being molded into visibility, one child retreating into invisibility. and both suffering in completely different ways. But Meghan wasn't retreating. She did what she had always done when pressure mounted. She stepped forward. Her virtual press conference wasn't spontaneous. It was surgical. Every object behind her was placed intentionally. Her book displayed prominently, the lighting soft, her posture composed. She didn't look defensive, she looked resolved. She declared that Lilibet wasn't being exploited, she was being empowered. She framed herself not as someone forcing responsibility onto a child, but as someone nurturing extraordinary potential. She positioned Harry as someone stuck in outdated thinking, someone trying to suppress opportunity rather than protect innocence. But what she didn't realize was that every word she spoke was reinforcing Princess Anne's resolve. Because Princess Anne wasn't listening to Meghan's defense, she was listening to Meghan's perspective. And Meghan had revealed something unintentionally devastating. She had revealed that she didn't see this as temporary, she saw it as destiny. When Meghan described Lilibet as her second chance, it confirmed everything Princess Anne feared. This wasn't about Lilibet's independent future, this was about Meghan rewriting her own past through her daughter's present. And Princess Anne understood exactly how dangerous that mindset could become. Because once a parent ties their identity to their child's performance, the child stops being allowed to fail, stops being allowed to rest, stops being allowed to choose. They become essential, and essential things aren't released willingly. Behind the scenes, Princess Anne began coordinating with Catherine, and Catherine approached the situation differently, not as an enforcer, but as a bridge. She began building something quietly, something nobody outside palace walls initially understood. The Windsor Reset, a summit unlike anything the family had attempted before. No advisors, no lawyers, no public relations teams, just Harry, Meghan, Princess Anne, Prince William, Catherine, 5 people, 1 table, 1 purpose. Catherine personally wrote Meghan a letter, not as a royal, but as a mother. And one line inside that letter carried a weight that echoed through everyone who read it. I believe we both want them to feel loved before they feel watched. Loved before watched. That wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation. But Princess Anne prepared for both outcomes. Because if Meghan accepted the summit, there was hope. But if Meghan refused, Princess Anne was ready to escalate. And escalate she would. Investigations had already begun into Meghan's commercial branding, specifically whether royal identifiers, symbols, lineage references, visual associations were being used in ways that crossed legal boundaries. If confirmed, Princess Anne knew those privileges could be stripped instantly. The brand could be severed from royal identity completely, not Lilibet's heritage, but everything built around it. Princess Anne wasn't trying to punish Meghan, she was trying to remove incentive. Because without royal association, the structure supporting Lilibet's commercial positioning would collapse. And that changed everything. King Charles had quietly approved these preparations, because he understood something deeply personal. He had watched what public pressure, parental conflict, and institutional tension had done to his own children decades earlier. He knew exactly how permanent that damage could become. And he wasn't willing to watch history repeat itself through his grandchildren. Meanwhile, Meghan remained silent about the summit invitation. No acceptance, no refusal, just silence. And that silence became its own answer. Because silence meant hesitation, and hesitation meant uncertainty. And uncertainty meant Meghan finally understood something she hadn't expected. This time, she wasn't controlling the timeline. Princess Anne was. Inside palace walls, the conclusion had already formed. Princess Anne wasn't fighting Meghan, she was fighting for Lilibet's right to grow up without obligation, for Archie's right to exist without fear, for 2 children to live lives defined by themselves, not by legacy, not by redemption, not by narrative. And as the Windsor Summit approached, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't about winning. It was about stopping something before it became irreversible. Because Princess Anne had drawn her line, and she wasn't moving. Not this time. Not for anyone.